Can you make the Shure SM57 sound like an SM7B with just an equalizer? I think you can. Hey, Julian Kraus here, and I thought to myself if it is possible to tweak the SM57 in post-processing to sound similar or even identical to the famous Shure SM7B. Normally, it's not possible to make two different microphones sound identical in post-processing. That's because mics aren't one-dimensional devices. They record sound from all different angles specific to a particular mic. An equalizer, for example, can only change the frequency response of the microphone as a whole, but not only the on-axis response, without affecting the off-axis response as well. Don't get me wrong here, you can definitely get two mics sound more similar with EQ, but they will never sound the same. But right here we're in a different scenario, because the SM57 and the SM7B use a similar capsule. Let me read what Shure has to say about this. The SM7, the SM57 and the SM58 are all based on the Unidyne 3 capsule design. The SM7's capsule is not identical to the SM57 or 58, but it is similar. The SM7 also has a larger acoustical chamber behind the mic element, and this extends the low frequency response. And I guess there will be differences in the high frequency response between these mics as well, but again, the capsule design is already very close construction-wise, and this might make it feasible to use an EQ to align them even more and make them sound identical. So far, you have been listening to both of these mics without any equalization applied. I've been switching between the SM57 and the SM7B, and I think you can clearly hear the differences between the two mics. As you can hear, the SM57 has more pronounced high frequencies and also slightly less in bass compared to the SM7B. Now I will play back an audio sample where I EQ'd the SM57 to sound like the SM7B. This will be a blind test, but don't worry, I will reveal the mics right after that. For now, focus on the sound and see if you can tell a difference and if you're even able to identify the mics. There is a theory which states that if ever anyone discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it is here, it will instantly disappear and be replaced by something even more bizarre and inexplicable. There is a theory which states that if ever anyone discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it is here, it will instantly disappear and be replaced by something even more bizarre and inexplicable. There is another theory which states that this has already happened. There is another theory which states that this has already happened. Could you hear a difference, and did you even find out which recording was done with the SM7B or with the SM57? Leave a comment, I'm really curious if anybody can discern the two mics. And by the way, you can find more audio samples at the end of this video. Okay, I promised to reveal the mics, so here we go. Mic A is the SM7B and mic B is the EQ'd SM57. To be honest, when I heard the recordings, I couldn't tell which recording was done with which microphone, and even when I knew which recording was which, I still didn't hear any significant difference between the two recordings. And I guess that's a good thing, because this means that you can really turn an SM57 into an SM7B, or at least get it so close that you cannot tell a difference anymore. By the way, you can see that I have the SM57 slightly further away from my mouth, and that's because I've aligned the capsules of both mics to be the same distance from my mouth to make this comparison as fair as possible. Now let me show you how I got these mics to sound so similar and explain what you have to do to make your SM57 sound like an SM7B. It starts with the foam cover. The SM7B is way more protected against plosives than the SM57. That's because the SM7B employs a pretty big wind foam and the capsule is quite a bit recessed in the housing. The SM57 on the other hand does not really have any plosive protection, so in order to get it physically close to the SM7B, I had to put on the Shure A2WS wind foam. Okay, next up I wanted to use an EQ to make the two mics sound similar. Of course, I could have started tuning the equalizer by ear and get a pretty close result, but if you know me by now, I like to do things a little bit more scientifically. So I set up a speaker which was EQ'd flat with the help of a measurement microphone. Then I put the SM57 and the SM7B in front of it, and this way I could measure their frequency response. In case you're wondering how I could make these measurements without an anechoic chamber, Well, these are gated responses, so I only look at the initial direct sound of the speaker and I can exclude all the reflections of my room. A negative side effect of that is that I lose the resolution in the lower frequencies, and in this case I'm limited to frequencies above 200 Hz. That's not a problem though, because we are going to look at the frequency response in the low frequencies with a different technique later on. Now here you can see the frequency response of the SM7B and the SM57. I have already compensated for the difference in mic sensitivity and they are both matched at 1 kHz. As you can see, the frequency response curves are definitely not identical, but you can also see that there are some similarities between the two mics. Both have a slight rise towards 6000 Hz and immediately drop off above that. The SM7B drops off sharply and has a small destructive interference type of dip going on at 6.3K. Above that, both mics show a rising curve again and then fall off above 14 kHz. By the way, I first thought that this narrow notch in the SM7B's frequency response was due to my test setup, and I double checked that. But it is really coming from the SM7B. And I did also do a test of the SM7B without its metal grille, and the dip was still there. So it seems to be coming from the capsule itself. In practice, such a narrow dip is probably not going to be audible, but I have to confess I was not expecting such a frequency response from the SM7B. Okay, like I said, I wanted to EQ the SM57 to match the SM7B's frequency response. So I let REW calculate the difference between the two microphones. This is the difference curve, and when this line goes above 0 dB, this means that the output of the SM57 is higher than the output of the SM7B at this specific frequency. And conversely, when this line drops below 0 dB, the SM57's frequency response is lower than the SM7B's frequency response at that frequency. So the goal is to make this curve as flat as possible in order to minimize the differences between both mics. I then let REW calculate the EQ filters to get this difference curve flat. REW could get this pretty much perfect, but I also don't like to use 20 EQ filters. So I limited it to 3 peak filters, which will get the response reasonably flat. This is how the difference curve looks like after the 3 EQ filters are applied. Of course, you can still see the big spike, which is there because of the strong dip in the SM7B's frequency response. But again, it is such a narrow spike that I think I'm better off not trying to match that. Other than that, I have to say that the difference response looks pretty decent. And that's how I came up with the EQ settings for the high frequencies. Okay, but there is still a difference in the low frequencies, which I had to match. And for that, I did look at the frequency response without gating. This means that I could analyze frequencies down to 20 Hz, but the disadvantage is that I cannot exclude room reflections anymore. So the frequency responses you see here are not the real frequency responses of the two microphones. At low frequencies, my room will have a huge effect on the frequency response. And because I also have the microphones close to my speaker, the proximity effect will also change the frequency response considerably. Luckily, it is not critical to measure the exact frequency response because I'm only interested in the difference between the two mics. So if I put them in front of the speaker at the exact same position, the proximity effect and my room will affect both mics by an equal amount. When I then calculate the difference between the two mics, I get a curve which is not influenced by my room or the proximity effect anymore. As you can see, the SM7B really has an extended low frequency response compared to the SM57, and this difference can be easily minimized with a low shelf filter. This way the difference response can be made pretty much exactly flat. And here you can see that with the EQ, the real-world in-room responses line up nicely. Even though a low shelf filter matches both mics precisely, I think it is not the best solution because this low shelf also boosts very low frequencies by a substantial amount. When you are handling the mic or recording vocals, you can then end up with very heavy rumble or strong plosives. In that case, it is better to use a peak EQ filter to match the mic's frequency response down to 100 Hz and then let the frequency response of the SM57 naturally drop off below that. So again, technically speaking, a low shelf filter is the correct way to match both mics, but for vocal applications, the peak EQ filter method is the better choice. And there is hardly going to be any difference between the two methods for vocals, because there is really no useful content in human voices at very low frequencies anyways. If you are going to use the low shelf method, for example for miking a guitar cabinet, I would suggest you use a very sharp low cut filter below the frequencies you really don't need. Okay, I teased you long enough. Here are my EQ settings to turn an SM57 into an SM7B. You would match the high frequency range with these 3 EQ filters and then the low frequencies with one more filter. And that's how I suggest you EQ the SM57 for vocals in pretty much any situation. If you really wanted to perfectly match the low frequency range, you could use a low shelf filter instead of the peak EQ, but then you really have to watch out for excessive low frequency rumble. Now you can simply take these EQ settings and copy them into pretty much any equalizer. So you can use this technique with any DAW or even live streaming software which allows you to EQ your mic in real time. And this is how the frequency responses of both mics compare after EQing the SM57. And as you can see, both start out relatively flat and then show a slight rise towards a 6K. The SM7B is a bit wavier, but the SM57's response pretty much follows the same trend. Then around 6.5K both drop off and then rise again to peak at 8 to 9K. Then they both stay relatively constant between 10 and 14K, and above that they drop off steeply. Both frequency responses are definitely not identical, but I think they are pretty damn close. So what are the pros and cons of this EQing method? Well, first of all, the SM57 is considerably cheaper than the SM7B, which I would say is the biggest argument for doing this. One more advantage is that the SM57 has a higher sensitivity, which means that it is easier to get low noise recordings. And because you additionally pull down the high frequencies of the SM57 with an equalizer, you also pull down the noise, lowering the noise floor even further. So it's unlikely that you need something like a Cloudlifter or Fathead with the SM57. The preamps in most audio interfaces can give you a very low noise recording in combination with this mic. The SM7B on the other hand has an incredibly low sensitivity, and depending on the preamps in your recording device, you might even have to buy an inline preamp, which makes the difference in cost between an EQ'd 57 and the SM7B even bigger. One small disadvantage is that the SM57 with the A2WS windshield is a tiny bit more prone to plosives, so in this regard the SM7B has the upper hand. And of course, for some people owning a real SM7B is part of the whole experience, and an EQ'd SM57 cannot substitute the SM7B in this regard. That said, I think that EQing an SM57 is a really good alternative to buying an SM7B. Okay, that's it for now. I will leave you with some more audio samples where I put the SM57 and the SM7B in front of a speaker. I will play the exact same music and constantly switch between the mics. Enjoy!